Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our Zero Trust webinar series. This afternoon, we're going to be covering implementing Cisco Zero Trust Architecture. My name is JB Sambauer, and I'm going to be your primary presenter today. I'm also joined by a bunch of the Modern Cyber team, so feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat or Q&A panel. Today we're going to be covering quite a bit of material, so definitely wanted to encourage everyone to speak up and ask their questions as we go along. Just a quick background on myself. I spent about a decade working as a global architect on the global security architecture team at Cisco. Prior to that, I actually spent quite a bit of time working at a Cisco partner as well. Quick summary on Modern Cyber. So Modern Cyber is a Cisco advisor partner. So we work with a lot of the channel partners out there, as well as directly with customers, focused on helping them design, implement, and even manage and operate some of the Cisco security solutions, and more specifically, Zero Trust architecture solutions. One of the big things I did want to call out, in case I forget a little bit later, make sure you check out our Zero Trust knowledge base. We do a lot of work on helping customers and organizations understand the differences between different approaches to Zero Trust, between the different vendors, between the different industry analyst models. And this resource is a great resource to help you understand strategy, maturity, and architecture, and hopefully come away with a little bit of knowledge on some of the differences between some of the architectures. So just a quick recap of our webinar series. So we started earlier this month with Zero Trust strategy, maturity, and architecture. We focused on some of the lessons learned over the last I'll say half a decade of working with customers on their Zero Trust journey. Today's session will be all about working with Cisco Zero Trust Architecture and implementing it. And then on July 20th, led by Chad Mitchell and Tina as well from the Modern Cyber team, they're going to focus on a practitioner's guide to meeting the U.S. government Zero Trust requirements. So for those of you that are government contractors or government entities, great webinar for you to attend to understand some of the requirements and how some of the technology out there can help. From an agenda standpoint, today we're actually going to be starting with a quick overview of Cisco Zero Trust, and then we'll jump into planning and design and implementation, and hopefully have time for a little bit of Q&A towards the end. One of the big things I always like to tell people is, the hardest part of this is planning it out so it's going to meet the requirements that your organization has. And one of the key things to do that is understand and plan the architecture correctly. Now, before we jump into some of the implementation, I thought it'd be good to update you on Cisco's latest information around Zero Trust, their architecture, and really what drives their implementation and their solution offerings in this space. One of the biggest things that we found over the years is that there's a big trade-off that organizations have to face. They start with this challenge of comparing productivity with security. And one of the challenges that you run into is high productivity typically is creating some level of risk exposure. There's no constraints on the users, networks, or applications. And then strong security, a lot of times, will end up bogging down the end user experience. Now, I don't know about you, but I hate when security kind of slows me down at my job. And I think most employees end up running into that same issue. And so at Cisco, they really focused on the concept of frustrating attackers and not users, and finding a Zero Trust sweet spot, which really combines the best of both worlds: strong security, high productivity, empowering the end users to do the right thing, and making sure that security is everyone's business. The other thing that I do applaud Cisco on is focusing on looking at the full gambit of Zero Trust. And Cisco really does believe that Zero Trust has to be defined holistically prior to some level of organizational adoption or implementation. And one of the key things to that is building out some of the key parts of the taxonomy and definitions within an organization. So a good example of that is starting with principles, influencing the strategy for the organization, defining what your Zero Trust platform is going to look like, defining capabilities, technologies, and features to enable those principles and strategy. And let's take a couple moments to kind of go through that in more detail. If we start on the principle side, if you joined us for our first webinar, I talked through Modern Cyber's Zero Trust principles, very similar to Cisco, very similar to some of the other vendors. Just a couple key differences here. With Cisco, their focus is never to assume trust. This means there shouldn't be communication from a user, a device, coming from a network or an application or service that is assumed to be trustworthy. Always verify trust and then enforce some level of least privilege. And those three principles should be something you're thinking about during planning, design, and implementation. I always make the comment to different organizations that every architectural review board, every design and change control process should incorporate the Zero Trust principles to ensure you're not deploying new technology to support the business without incorporating some level of Zero Trust standards across your both design and implementation. Now, alongside the principles, Cisco's strategy around Zero Trust is to embed Zero Trust across the fabric of the multi-environment IT. This includes hybrid work. This is users working at home, from an office, on the move. And really the goal here is to protect the integrity of the business by securing access in a way that frustrates the attackers and not the end users. And you can see this is a pretty important part of the strategy, which is we want to do this, but we want to do this in a way that's going to give the end users a better experience, not a worse experience. And when we look at the platform itself, Cisco brings a breadth of different solutions that help enable the end-to-end Zero Trust architecture. And so one thing that's kind of key here is when we're looking at Cisco as a Zero Trust partner, their ability to bring in threat detection and response, prioritization, investigation, and orchestration on top of their Zero Trust enforcement and policy decision points, focused around things like user and device security, network and cloud security, and even application and data security, you'll see that each of these have a tie to the overall broader platform. And like I mentioned at Modern Cyber, our big goal is to seamlessly integrate into this platform and help customers assess, design, deploy, optimize, and manage a Zero Trust architecture. Now, one of the other key callouts here is Cisco's Zero Trust strengths. One of the things at Cisco is providing a full methodology around how to apply Zero Trust strategy and principles to the different policy decision and enforcement points. And that starts by establishing trust. And that could be establishing trust of users and devices, the network and cloud, applications or data. And then from there, it's really about understanding, well, do I trust this user? Is their authentication something that's secure? Is their device secure? Is it a managed machine? Does it meet my minimum level of trust in order to access an application or resource? Now, once we've established trust, it makes it much easier to do what we call enforcing trust-based access, which applies consistent unified policy based on verification. This is checking at every access control decision whether or not that user is trusted, the device is trusted. There hasn't been an indication of compromise or a threat on that machine prior to allowing it access to an app or data. And then where most vendors really have that, first two parts of the framework, Cisco really excels and has strength around being able to provide continuous verification of trust and helping to respond to changes in trust automatically. And what this means is once a user or device or application is authorized, doesn't mean they're authorized forever. We're going to continually look at the state of that machine, the state of the user, a looking at the risk and trust so that we're able to respond as things change. And I always like to tell people that's what makes cyber so hard is if everything stayed the same, it would be easy. You would understand the risk, understand the security controls, and you'd be able to work towards that common state. The problem is things change all the time. And with Zero Trust, it's actually one of the core benefits. We want to apply this continuous verification process throughout authentications and authorizations that occur on a day-to-day basis. Now, if we break that down a little bit further, we can see the capabilities required within each of those different stages within the methodology. So when we're establishing trust, we're looking at the user, the device, the service or application identity. This could be, everything from a user accessing a SaaS application to two microservices containers communicating with one another. Still need to establish some level of identity and trust. On top of that, we want to look at posture and context. Are they coming from a managed machine? Are they in the same location that they normally are on a Thursday afternoon? And then finally, applying some level of risk-based authentication. So not only do we authenticate the user and device, but what is the risk level? Does their machine have vulnerabilities? Have we seen indications of compromise? All of those things will help us establish trust so that then we can apply and enforce trust-based access control. And within enforcement, this happens with microsegmentation, unified access control, and then being able to apply least privilege and explicit trust definitions. So I talked about removing implicit trust. This means things aren't a permit any or a implicit allow. In this explicit trust world, we have a very defined policy that's going to allow Jamie on his managed machine to access financial data. When we get into continuously verifying trust, then we look at things like reassessment of the original trust factors, shared signals, behavior monitoring, and even vulnerability management driving that continuous trust verification. And then finally, if we do see a prioritized incident response required, we can immediately change the trust, change the level of access, and even do things like deprovision workloads or containers, and really give the right framework for the customer to work through that. Now, all of these things are applied for whether or not we're applying Zero Trust principles to user and device security, network and cloud security, as well as application and data security. One of the big questions that does come up, though, is what technologies in Cisco's vast portfolio actually enable Cisco Zero Trust Architecture? And when we take a deeper look into this, you can see from a product standpoint and a technology standpoint, when we're thinking about user and device security, primary technology there is going to be Secure Access by Duo, or Access Management by Duo is the new name, Secure Endpoint, and even Kenna Security for vulnerability management. On the network and cloud security side, we look at tools like Identity Services Engine, Umbrella, and Cisco Secure Access, Secure Firewall, and Secure Network Analytics, all to help provide that level of context and policy enforcement across that area. And finally, in the application and data security side, Secure Workload, Secure Cloud Analytics, both provide very important information, both from a policy standpoint and a continuous monitoring standpoint from a threat visibility standpoint. The last thing I did want to mention here is Cisco XDR. So one of the things that was more recently announced by Cisco was Cisco XDR, which is the evolution to their SecureX platform. A lot of great capabilities there, not only providing a better endpoint and network detection and response solution, but also the ability to integrate more third parties and make the management and operations processes a little bit easier. And we'll talk through how XDR actually can help enable some of these Zero Trust use cases, especially when it comes to the implementation journey. Now, we talked about user and device, network and cloud, and application and data. I did want to take a moment to include this mapping back to both the NIST cybersecurity framework, the CISA Zero Trust framework, as well as some of the common services that cut across all three. You can see very easily, while Cisco has simplified some of the pillars that we typically talk about when it comes to Zero Trust, they do have a direct one-to-one mapping to those existing models. Now, one thing that Cisco does is they put out this great reference architecture. If you've never seen the Cisco Security Reference Architecture, this is version 3.1. A lot of the Cisco security architects that are actually former colleagues of mine spent a lot of time developing this to kind of show the breadth of the capabilities, functionality within the portfolio. The challenge that most organizations might run into is this is an eye chart. How do I take something like this reference architecture and turn it into something practical for my organization to implement when it comes to Zero Trust? And that's what the rest of the hour is going to be all about, is being able to focus on taking the primary technologies and supporting technologies that Cisco has to offer to help enable those Zero Trust principles and strategy that your organization might be facing. And I can tell you from past experience, it's a lot easier to say this than to do it. A lot of organizations struggle with taking the off-the-shelf technology and implementing it in the correct way to be able to enforce Zero Trust principles. Now I'm going to take a moment to see if we've gotten any questions so far in the chat or Q&A panel. Let's see. One question coming in: how is Zero Trust being utilized with security for AI, protecting the ML ecosystems and enterprise 100 companies? Is there a big complement to use Zero Trust for AI? It's a great question, Louise. One of the big things that we're seeing right away with a lot of the evolution in AI has been applying it to security use cases to help actually achieve better security outcomes. The vice versa, which is how do we secure the AI ecosystems that are out there and make sure that we don't run into another Skynet type scenario from Terminator, is another practical example of where Zero Trust can come into play. So one of the things that's kind of key is, if we think back to the Zero Trust principles, removing implicit trust and being able to enforce least privilege, these same Zero Trust principles that we're applying to use cases like user, device, networks, apps, and data can also be applied in the AI realm. How do I give access to my AI to be able to access data? Well, I need it to have a certain level of access. It shouldn't be able to read and write. Maybe it should only be able to read that data. So while it is a very early on, I'll say there are quite a few startups actually in this space that have focused on applying security to AI systems that are out there and being built. Google's actually been doing a lot of work in this space as well. And actually, we do have a couple blogs out there around AI and ML on the Modern Cyber blog that might be helpful as well. So this next section, we wanted to jump right into planning and design. Now, I talked through that reference architecture at a high level, and sometimes when we do that, I kind of think like this old GIF out there that essentially kind of shows a little bit craziness mapping these things out. Where do I start with all of these different capabilities and technologies? And the short answer is it starts with data. You shouldn't just haphazardly pick what your next step in your Zero Trust journey should be. A big opportunity for your organization and other organizations is to start by baselining the current maturity. Now, we talked in our first webinar around Zero Trust maturity in great detail. If you didn't check that out, make sure you check out the recording because we talk about how the CISO model actually can help organizations baseline and then come up with that journey plan around the technologies. Above and beyond establishing that baseline and maturity, organizations should spend quite a bit of time at defining what their deployment cycle should look like. And really, this is what's going to help significantly in the planning. So along with the maturity, you should start with some level of system and user inventory and a level of understanding of business processes as it relates to security operations. How does a user that can't get to an application tell the organization that that's occurring? Is it a help desk ticket? How much manual interaction does that take? And today, if you have, let's say, 100 policies per user, and with least privilege, you end up moving to something like 1,000 policies for that same user, how will the organization operationalize the changes in policy without actually requiring a ton of additional employees? Now, once we have a baseline assessment of the systems, the devices, whether they be managed or unmanaged, that's where you can start to understand risk and also incorporate some of the zero trust strategy and principles and that maturity baseline into an evaluation process. As a part of that process, then you can prioritize the deployments. Do you have enough staff or help from partners to be able to deploy and parallel the different technologies? Or will there have to be a single technology introduced at a time? And how would the time frame look like for your organization? And one of the key things here is once you take one of the technologies or compensating controls for users or devices or network or applications, then you start to get into this cycle where you'll move it into operations, into production, and you can help create the feedback loop to simplify the operational procedures. Now, this is where I wanted to start jumping into some of the Cisco technologies and talk you through where they're going to help significantly as a part of this process. So while we've talked about getting information and starting with visibility and establishing trust, one of the key things to do that is, well, how do I understand user and device trust? This is where Cisco Duo actually comes in and is able to do things like understand the risk associated with a user authentication, the device trust associated with that device, whether it's managed, unmanaged, whether or not it meets a posture baseline before it accesses any applications within the organization. Then we look at technology like ICE for those organizations that still have quite a bit of on-prem presence, and they have devices like IP cameras, IP phones, could be a medical device, could be an ATM machine if you're in financial, could be a point of sale system if you're in a restaurant or hospitality environment. ICE actually can take it a step further and help establish trust and give visibility to all of the users and devices that are connecting to wired, wireless, and VPN type systems. And this is going to provide a level of visibility and hopefully enough data for you to define what is that baseline level of trust that should be required across my organization. And finally, when it comes to the cloud and applications and data, Secure Workload is a great technology to help cluster or group together the different asset inventory, prepare and actually let you know the different communication patterns, and then also establish trust by looking at process vulnerabilities and threats on that workload. So a lot of key capabilities in helping establish trust and give you the visibility so you have somewhere to start. One of the challenges I find most organizations, we get to the whiteboard, we start planning out policy, and without the data that says, well, wait, we've got 500 of these microscopes that are running Windows XP, and they're a huge risk. If you can't bring that risk and that visibility data into the policy discussion, it's going to be a very long and difficult process. I'll tell you, actually, me and Chad worked with a customer a few years back, and that customer spent about 7 years defining policy because they did it all based on theory and based on a whiteboard and Excel spreadsheet. They didn't take the time to actually get the visibility first so they could define the assets and communication flows. And because of that, it took them probably 5 to 6 times the amount of time that it would take for someone that had the data behind it. Now, one of the things you should hopefully be thinking about right away is, well, wait a second, this is 3 different solutions, and now I'm jumping across different consoles. So how has Cisco really helped organizations centralize or unify the visibility? And the real answer is with Cisco XDR, based on SecureX device insights, we get a consolidated list of detailed asset information pulled from those multiple sources. So if we're running ICE and Duo and Umbrella and a bunch of different solutions, the unified visibility that we can get inside of XDR can help us have that consolidated inventory. It can also tell us things like, well, wait, secure endpoints deployed on 80% of the managed machines, not 100%. That is a gap in our coverage. The other big thing with XDR, the reason why I say XDR and not another solution, is with Cisco's XDR solution, there is native secure cloud analytics built in, which gives you detailed communications and flow visibility. This means I can actually group together devices, establish trust of those devices, have my inventory, and then understand how those devices are communicating across my organization. Now, the other big thing that comes about is to simplify this a little bit further and to take a step back. When we're looking at Zero Trust Architecture from Cisco, we can kind of start in this realm of user, managed device, unmanaged device, IoT device, networks, and then apps and data. When I look at it this way, I can start to apply and see where some of the solutions are going to make a huge impact. So when it comes to Duo, for example, we're able to establish trust of users. We're also able to establish trust of those managed and unmanaged machines. Now, while Duo is focused on the end user, it's not going to authenticate the IoT device itself. We'll get to the IoT use case in a second. The other thing that is pretty critical to establishing trust and designing the Zero Trust Architecture is how we're going to deal with establishing trust of those managed devices. So Cisco Secure Client is a replacement for Cisco AnyConnect, and it also incorporates the Secure Endpoint Client, the Umbrella Roaming Agent, as well as other tools like ICE Posture. So this single client actually can provide a granular level of detail around what that device is doing, what is the level of status, and also help enable certain use cases like roaming protection, on-premise or wired, wireless, and VPN posture, as well as help us use something like Meraki SM to verify the device trust. Now, the other big feature is when we're looking at providing security across those devices, the network, and apps and data, we can see that tools like Umbrella and Next-Gen Firewall actually come into place. Now, Next-Gen Firewall sit across the network because we might have a campus use case, we might have a data center use case, we might have an internet edge use case. The traditional Next-Gen Firewall can really help with being able to apply some of those existing policies, but also be a key access control decision point for your Zero Trust policies. And then when it comes to Umbrella, a lot of the capabilities that have been in Next-Gen Firewall are actually in Umbrella. And we'll talk about Cisco Secure Access, or SSE. That is the new release that got publicly announced at Cisco Live US this year. That actually brings us even more capabilities in what we can apply to the different use cases across devices, the network itself, and apps and data. Now, the last key components in this architecture are going to be ICE, which we talked about helps from the user authentication, device authentication, and protecting access to wired, wireless, and VPN networks. And then on the flip side of that, with Cisco Secure Workload, we're able to provide protection of the apps and data. Now, all of these tools by themselves, you could pick up and probably put a third party or a competitive product in place where these boxes exist. The challenge with that, and in some cases you might have some competitive products in the place, the challenge that you run into is where Cisco really shines is the integrations that actually help organizations operationalize this type of architecture. And to kick things off, the big line you see kind of at the bottom is integrating ICE, which has our user device posture context for wired, wireless, and VPN sessions with Cisco Secure Workload, which has context around workloads that might be in private cloud, public cloud, or even applications that might exist in a third-party cloud. And be able to integrate the two to have consistent policy across this. The other key integration is ICE, Secure Workload, and Duo all communicating with our Meraki SM and our Cisco Secure Endpoint to pull in context around threat, as well as pull in context around the types of devices and whether or not it's trusted. So you can start to see how integrated each component is, and for each one of these lines, they represent a formal integration that Cisco's built, they maintain, and they actually support for customers. If you start to replace some of these boxes, absolutely, you can integrate the components, but a lot of that's going to come back on you to create the integration and support the integration. The other one that I did want to call out is unification of a lot of the data, and that is going to be done in Cisco XDR. Being able to get those threat signals and inventory and context into a central location that can integrate with all of the different components to help give us a unified Zero Trust Architecture dashboard. Now, one thing that I did want to relay here is, okay, so we've talked about some of the key components. How do we lay out an implementation plan that's going to help an organization get from zero capabilities when it comes to Zero Trust Architecture to fully deployed and configure and operationalize Zero Trust Architecture? So if we start at the top, we look at kind of what I like to call phase zero, or an initial deployment. So one of the first things that you should be focused on is deploying things like ICE and Secure Workload for that visibility. Get the next-gen firewall umbrella out there for visibility into flows, applications, users, devices, and even I like to call out here data-centric information. So Umbrella does data loss prevention and can help the organization understand what type of confidential data is crossing the network, as well as what type of confidential data exists in things like Dropbox or going across collab tools like WebEx. And then the final one would be getting Duo, Meraki SM, and Secure Client deployed out there so that you're able to establish trust of all the users and devices that are out there and managed. Now, phase one is what I like to call integrations. And the focus here should be, once we have the data and we've started to deploy the different silos out there, then we want to start to combine the context and share context across the architecture. So a good starting place here would be integrating ICE, Secure Workload, and Next-Gen Firewall. You also have that integration of Duo, Meraki, and Umbrella. And then a final one would be integrating XDR so that you're able to have that central visibility and dashboards. Now, the next step is one that is a little bit controversial, depending on who you talk to, is a lot of organizations try to jump from what I call phase one to phase three directly. They think the vision is least privilege. They're going to get there right away. This is probably the number one best practice that you can take out of this, is that there is a great middle step here where within phase two, the recommendation for implementing Zero Trust Architecture in a way that's not going to cause more operational challenges and problems would be to minimize the attack surface. So immediately start to define some basic levels of restrictions associated with risky devices. So what types of devices should never be allowed on your network, communicating with your applications, working with your data. Many organizations, one of the best practices here is to define a level of low trust, that would always be denied, medium trust, which can access some applications and data, and high trust, which gets a level of privileged access. And then once we have the ability to deny based on that level of risk, then start to deny some of the risky communications. So I'll give you a great example here. Least privilege, you have to understand every flow and create the policies based on what is needed for that organization, device, user, application, etc., communications that are occurring. When I say deny risky communications, what it means is there are some low-hanging fruit that you can attach to that's going to make a huge impact. So by being able to deny lateral movement type protocols, Microsoft SMB, RPC, PSExec, other ransomware, and other tools will use these communications to be able to propagate from one host to another. Before you try to tackle least privilege holistically, do the bottom, the minimum here, and be able to deny the biggest risky communications that are occurring across your organization. And then the final phase would be moving into monitoring the communications, turning that visibility that you have into the communications into policy, and then operationalizing least privilege by enforcing and closing the loop on any type of denies that do occur. Now, for our last section in this, we wanted to talk through implementation and specifically around some of the things I previously mentioned during planning. So when we're thinking about implementation, each of those individual tools do need to be implemented. And so some best practices here when it comes to tools implementation. Let's start from Cisco Secure Workload. And I know a lot of you probably might have some previous knowledge of Cisco Secure Workload, but I always find it helpful to understand or level set some of the major benefits here. So the reason why I personally think Secure Workload is one that really can help with your Zero Trust journey is it's going to start by collecting a lot of context and data. And how it does that is uses virtual sensors, so software sensors, hardware sensors, and can even pull context into the real-time streaming flows into the back-end Cisco Secure Workload big data store. Now, one of the biggest benefits of this is we can start to use that flow communication and match it up with context. So whether it be Cisco ICE or a third party like using ServiceNow CMDB data, AWS data, Docker data, Kubernetes data, all can actually mark up and give the appropriate level of context to those flows. Once we have the flows, the communications, and we're able to essentially come in here and have all that data in one place, we can actually use Secure Workload to give us application insight and map out all of the communication patterns that are happening. We can also run what's called application dependency mapping. So for those of you that haven't had to try to implement least privilege before, this is actually taking that visibility into every communication and then creating and proposing all of the appropriate policies that need to be allowed for that application to continue to function. From here, we can actually generate the policies and start to look at an actual simulation of what would be allowed, what would be denied if we would have implemented that policy today, tomorrow, or go back in time and actually look at historical data and say, hey, if this policy would have been implemented 30 days ago, what would have been denied? And from there, we can actually reduce the risk of deploying that Zero Trust policy. That policy can be implemented on a software enforcement agent, or in many cases, many customers opt to actually use that policy export and enforce it on things like their next-gen firewall or another third party that actually has a policy engine. The other thing that is key to understand with Secure Workload is it has vulnerability data, process behavior monitoring, and looks at deviations and what the baseline normally is. And it can trigger an action or quarantine based on any type of threat or vulnerability seen. So if you ever have an incident like a piece of middleware that ends up having a major vulnerability, it needs to be patched. Anything that's outstanding, you could actually quarantine or isolate until it gets patched and then successfully bring it back online. There's also forensic capabilities and third-party event notifications so that it can help you operationalize everything a little bit better. Now, one other thing I did want to show and leave in here for later reference is it is mapping out individual workloads. It can go down to a container level to help understand the level of communication. So understand the context, understand the communication. Now, where this becomes extremely interesting is when we start to integrate Secure Firewall or another tool with that Cisco Secure Workload policy engine. So once we have a recommended policy, now we can actually deploy that policy over to the Secure Firewall Management Center, which can enforce across all of the different firewalls that are out there. This happens automatically, and there is a closed loop. So any of the flows that are getting denied actually get sent back up to Secure Workload that can trigger new policy runs, new ADM runs, etc. The other thing I didn't mention with that is ICE integration. So along with having context from the different workloads, we can link the context that ICE has around who the user is, what the device is that's communicating. Now, might sound, oh, that's nice to have, not a need to have. How are you supposed to implement least privilege policy without understanding who the sources are and grouping those together so that you can apply least privilege? If we have a network video recorder that's sitting in the data center, is being protected by Cisco Secure Workload, and we need to only allow least privilege to that network video recorder, we would need to understand that these 50 IP addresses are IP cameras. And those IP cameras are the only things that should be allowed to stream video back to our network video recorder. Now, the ICE integration actually helps Secure Workload get context and enforce policy end-to-end. Just to do a quick summary on why ICE is extremely important to Zero Trust for the network, it starts with being able to authenticate every user, device, and thing that's connecting to wired, wireless, or VPN. Hopefully, all of you have heard of ICE in the past. Where it becomes extremely helpful is the integration. So integration into existing identity services, Duo, Azure, Active Directory, LDAP. We can also pull in data from endpoint mobility management or mobile device management tools. This could be Meraki SM. It could be a third party like Microsoft Endpoint Manager or Intune. And then finally, within ICE, it's also integrating with Secure Firewall, Secure Cloud Analytics, Secure Network Analytics, and a host of other things to make sure that context around whether or not that user and device is trusted is available in every policy decision and enforcement tool that's out there. Now, the other big reason why we talk about ICE when it comes to Zero Trust is how do we remove implicit trust from something like a network? Networks have always been built to be allow communications. What ends up happening is by default, everything is allowed. And if we don't actually apply some level of segmentation, we won't actually meet those Zero Trust principles for removing implicit trust and enforcing least privilege. The biggest challenge with segmentation in the past is 10, 15, 20 years ago, if I wanted to create segmentation for an enterprise network, I would have to talk to the network team. I would have to create a brand new network for that use case. So, hey, we have a voice VLAN, a data VLAN. Now we need BYOD support. We got to add a new BYOD VLAN. We've got to create the routing redundancy, a DHCP scope, and subnet addressing to even enable that single use case. If it's across 100 sites, I might need to deploy that to 100 locations. This means I can only scale segmentation as much as my network can scale, and it's a very difficult task to work through both design and in operations. So with TrustSec or group-based policy, ICE actually enables us to create segmentation based on a tag or group membership, and it's agnostic to the topology of the network itself. So this is what can actually enable use cases like blocking lateral movement and denying risky devices, risky communications across an enterprise network without having to spend a whole heck of a lot of time analyzing communication patterns first. Now, with Duo, I know many of you probably are running Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. Where Duo actually comes into play is it can be the zero trust access to your applications that can integrate with your existing primary authentication solution. So with Duo, we can enable authentication of users, both multi-factor authentication or passwordless authentication. We can differentiate based on user role or groups. And then the other key factor here, so a lot of identity providers out there will do multi-factor authentication, but they're not bringing in the device trust and risk-based authentication. So with Duo, one of the key differences and why it's so important with Zero Trust Architecture is we're able to establish device trust by checking whether it's managed or unmanaged, and also look at things like the device health and compliance status. This is what we also can help us enable single sign-on use cases, VPN-less remote access, and integrate all the applications for the end user or organization that's deploying. Now, a couple quick demos here, like one of the key things that we see all the time, hey, SMB shares are out there and they're unprotected and it's key to my data. In this demo, you can see we're doing a passwordless based auth using Windows Hello. It's actually able to help us connect in and actually do SMB access. And with this, we're getting our file share access through the Zero Trust Network Access Duo Network Gateway. And my apologies, the labels are backwards. So that one said remote desktop. This is actually remote desktop, and that was SMB. So here you can see this a similar use case using passwordless authentication to access remote desktop. If you look at the last 100 breaches last year, many of them did involve remote desktop access. And by using Duo in front of our remote desktop, now we can actually enforce user trust, device trust, and continuously verify trust as users are accessing those types of resources. So a couple additional, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on secure endpoint, umbrella, or secure access, but I think it's important to call out what I mentioned earlier again. So Cisco has done a lot of work around providing a single agent that can help enable VPN access, posture assessment for VPN or for Identity Services Engine, Cisco Secure Endpoint, so that is the anti-malware, anti-virus solution that can also do things like exploit prevention and endpoint detection and response, and an endpoint protection platform. Orbital, which is used for forensics, network visibility module. So NVM's less known, it actually can take any flows from an endpoint and send them up to things like Secure Cloud Analytics or Cisco Secure Workload. So for every endpoint that's out there, whether it's on-premise or remote, we're able to get visibility into all of the traffic flows, including process ID and a lot of the data you would need to enable those zero trust access policies. And finally, you get umbrella roaming, which can help enable both DNS, secure web gateway policies, and with the latest announcement at Cisco Live, also things like cloud delivered firewall. So you'll see Cisco Secure Access is going beyond the initial umbrella capabilities of DNS and secure internet gateway and enables zero trust capabilities quite a bit for organizations that want VPN as a service, Zero Trust Network as a service, and also the key thing that is beneficial here is to centralize policy. So we can help give users the same exact experience, whether they're remote, working from home, at Starbucks, or on premise. And that is a big challenge I think most organizations are fighting with right now when they're implementing Zero Trust is where do I start to evolve policy? If I have a completely different policy for remote users versus on-prem users, I'm not going to be able to maintain and apply least privilege in 20, 30 different policy enforcement points. So what Cisco Secure Access and Secure Access Services Edge brings to the table is that central policy for firewall, SWG, and ZTNA capabilities all in a single platform. And last, because I did introduce it quite a bit, some of you might not have heard of Cisco XDR. Really, it incorporates everything we've talked about up to this point: secure endpoint, secure cloud analytics, and then even the biggest difference with XDR is the ability to prioritize incidents and use risk and trust to prioritize threat. As a part of that, it gives us the ability to do things like incident response and integrate into the Zero Trust policy engines, whether it be Duo or ICE or Secure Workload, so that when we do see a threat, we're able to immediately take action and respond. All right, I know I can talk a little bit quickly. I appreciate everybody hanging in there with me. One of the biggest things I wanted to leave you with is the value. So we talked a lot about designing and implementing Cisco Zero Trust Architecture. One of the things that Cisco actually went out and did was looked at the value and the return on investment. So you can see in the sources, there was a total economic impact study done of Cisco's integrated security platform, network access control solution to actually provide some of these statistics. So 45 to 50% decreased risk and cost of data breach. So better security when we implement Zero Trust, 191% higher performance, so return on investment and higher performance, and a 90% increase in SOC efficiency. So the key thing here is being able to implement Zero Trust without adding that operational overhead. Quick summary on today. We talked a lot about Cisco Zero Trust. One key call out, Cisco obviously has a comprehensive platform to enable Zero Trust. They do make it a lot easier than trying to put your own piecemeal solution together. The biggest thing that we recommend, and we hopefully hit home for you today, is implementation success relies on proper planning and design. How are you going to scale up policy to implement least privilege? How are you going to integrate context and policy engines across your organization? And then key is those integrations to make sure that operations can actually scale up for some of these challenges. Now, I know we only had an hour today. I could talk about this stuff for days on end. So please feel free to reach out to schedule a deep dive or a demo. Obviously, we're doing a lot when it comes to Cisco Zero Trust. And one of the things I always like to tell people, we are very much so the Sherpas of your Zero Trust journey. So Cisco provides all those tools and capabilities, and a lot of times working together, fitting together, and even some great training out there for you to understand them. There's still that need to help you scale that mountain, understand the pitfalls, configure things in a way that's actually going to meet your Zero Trust principles and strategy and help you get to the end of your journey. Modern Cyber does focus a lot on assessment, deployment, and management of these solutions, whether it be performing a Zero Trust assessment, ransomware readiness assessment, or helping you deploy something like Cisco ICE, Secure Workload, Secure Endpoint. And then for those of you that are smaller organizations, we've more recently introduced additional capabilities around Zero Trust as a service, where we can actually deploy and manage the continuous policy and help you go from zero to Zero Trust as a part of users, networks, devices, or apps and data. Now, thanks again for joining us today. On July 20th, as mentioned, we'll do a deeper dive into government solutions for Zero Trust, and we will keep the recordings up on the site. So feel free to share out with friends and others. Now, let me just take a peek real quick to see if we had any other questions come in. Just a few. Wonder if you can expand on the continuous verification for the 3 use cases: remote user, internal resource, and business-to-business communications. Where do the source of truth policies be hosted? So the key thing is, I mentioned, it's a great question, by the way. Continuous verification for remote users it takes an architecture really to build those things. So one of the key things there is the remote user itself, depending on whether they're going through a firewall policy or getting evaluated on access to an application. If, for example, in Cisco Zero Trust Architecture, we see a threat, if it's access to the application, Duo would actually pick up on that indication of compromise from Secure Endpoint and be able to block access. If it's access to an internal resource cutting across ICE or Secure Workload, both Cisco XDR, ICE, and Secure Workload all have capabilities to pick up on those IOCs, integrate with things like Secure Endpoint and the threat detection and response engines, and be able to change the levels of trust. And then B2B would be more based on the level of connectivity. If it's a B2B communication for an application, then the same thing I mentioned on Duo for users would apply for business-to-business communications. And then also, if it would be, for example, a extranet connection, a site-to-site VPN, for example, the XDR and orchestration capabilities that can dynamically change trust within ICE, Duo, or Secure Workload can also limit or change the policy for something like a VPN extranet communication for B2B. But great job or great question on some of the continuous verification capabilities there. Now, if there's no additional questions, I want to thank you again for your time, and feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions or if we can go deeper with you on a separate session. Thanks, everybody.